When we entered Paul Alexander's office, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of unfamiliar opulence. The massive room was almost entirely paneled in dark wood floor to ceiling, as if we had stepped into the cozy lair of a millionaire hunter. Huge windows overlooked the pristine expanse of Alaska's snow-covered wilderness, though the view was overshadowed by an abundance of trophies. Hunting rifles adorned the walls in elegant wooden cases polished to a gleaming finish, looking more like symbols of power than tools that had ever been fired. Mounted animal heads were everywhere. An enormous grizzly bear's head, frozen in an eternal snarl, loomed over the room, one clawed paw suspended as if ready to strike. Nearby, a mountain ram with spiraled horns stared blankly into the distance, while predatory birds perched in the corners, as though they might take flight at any moment. On one wall, I noticed the pelt of a snow leopard, its sheen unnervingly unnatural in the glow of a massive crystal chandelier that bathed the room in warm, golden light. Paul Alexander himself was a short, stocky man with thick silver hair. His rolled-up sleeves revealed strong, sinewy arms, and when he shook my hand, his grip was like steel. "Take a seat, gentlemen," he said with a faint accent, gesturing to the oversized leather chairs that looked like they were reserved for only the most distinguished guests. I sat, taking in the surroundings. Directly across from us stood a massive oak desk, behind which Paul sat like a king in his fortress. The desk was impeccably clean. No papers, just a box of expensive cigars and a few framed photographs. One showed Paul holding a rifle, standing over a downed lion. Another featured a desolate, snow-covered village, nestled in a dense forest. I guessed it was Danville. Sam, as usual, remained silent. He sat with a straight back, hands resting on his knees. Paul began speaking in a calm, measured tone as if he already knew we would agree. He described how Danville, isolated in the woods, had long been the subject of whispered legends about a mysterious creature known as the White Devil. A massive humanoid beast covered in snow-white fur, said to guard this forsaken land. The locals had abandoned the village decades ago, leaving it empty and forgotten. But Paul dismissed the stories as myths. It's just a large animal, maybe a bear or a wolf, but a rare one. And that means its place is here, he said, gesturing to an empty spot on the wall, as if he could already see its mounted remains. The longer he spoke, the more I noticed how skillfully he wielded his words. He wasn't asking us. He was making us believe we were the only ones capable of the task. A predatory gleam in his eye made me uneasy. "It's just an animal," I told myself, "and we need the money." Paul pulled out a checkbook, and as he slowly wrote out a number, he named the price. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sam flinch. We both knew that walking away now would be foolish. The money was enough to risk almost anything, maybe even our lives. When we left the office, the lingering scent of cigar smoke mixed with leather and wood clung to me. I glanced at Sam. "What do you think?" I asked. He only nodded. That was his way of saying he was in. The journey started out tolerable. I drove our old pickup, which groaned over every bump like it was complaining about its fate. The snow and icy wind didn't make the trip any more enjoyable, but as long as we stayed on the main road, things were manageable. Sam sat quietly beside me, staring out the window. He wasn't one for words, especially in places like this. The wind outside howled like a chorus of ghosts, but I tried to block out the unsettling sound. Things got worse when we left the highway. The back road, which had looked decent enough on the map, turned out to be narrow and nearly buried in snow. The tires slipped and skidded, and after a few miles, it became clear we wouldn't make it any farther in the old truck. I stopped, pulled out the map, and glanced at Sam. "I think walking will be faster than digging this old beast out of every drift," I muttered, more to convince myself than him. Sam nodded, checking his pack. As always, he looked composed, though I could sense his unease. The silence of this place felt oppressive, like even the forest was watching us. Bundling up against the biting cold, we set off. The snow reached our knees, turning every step into a struggle. The icy wind cut at our faces, and even through gloves, my fingers began to numb after just half an hour. Each time I looked back, the truck grew smaller until it vanished behind a bend. We were alone in the endless expanse of Alaska. The trail I had tried to follow on the map was non-existent. No sign of a path. We trudged forward, guided only by a compass and the sparse landmarks on the map. The sky was a heavy gray, threatening more snow. I caught myself counting steps, as if that would distract me from the cold. As darkness fell, we decided to set up camp. Pitching the tent was no easy feat. The deep snow and relentless wind fought us every step of the way. While Sam anchored the tent, I started a fire, not for warmth, but to carve out a small pocket of comfort in the freezing wilderness. We crawled inside, escaping the worst of the wind. That night I heard something strange. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I realized it was something else. A sharp noise like branches snapping or maybe footsteps. I sat up in my sleeping bag, trying not to make any sudden movements. Sam was awake too. His hand moved toward the rifle by the entrance. We exchanged a glance but said nothing. The sound came again outside. It could have been an animal, a wolf, a bear, or it could have just been the wind dragging snow across the clearing. But in that moment, every hair on my body stood on end. We stayed like that, tense and listening to every creak and shuffle, until the sounds faded away. I don't know what it was, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me until dawn. Morning came slowly, as if the sun was reluctant to rise over this frozen edge of the world. I crawled out of the tent, feeling the cold pierce through me instantly, despite the layers of clothing. Sam didn't look any better. Neither of us had slept much, but we had no choice. We had to keep moving. While Sam fiddled with his backpack, I took a moment to look around. The sounds we had heard during the night still echoed in my mind. I walked a wide circle around the campsite, scanning the snow for tracks. Nothing. No depressions, no paw prints, not even a broken branch. Either it had been the wind, or something that didn't leave traces. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to shrug it off. "Nothing," I said when I returned. Sam only nodded, clearly unwilling to discuss it either. We packed up camp, making sure to leave no trace of our presence, and set off again. The snow was still deep, but not as grueling as it had been during the night. The faint light of the hidden sun, veiled behind thick clouds, made the forest feel marginally less hostile. We walked in silence. The quiet broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the crunch of snow underfoot. By midday, with our legs aching and exhaustion setting in, we spotted something strange in the distance. Sam noticed it first. "Look," he said tersely, pointing ahead. I squinted and saw faint shapes taking form between the trees' buildings. As we approached, the air seemed to change. This was Danville. The village was nothing like I had expected. It was oddly well kept for a place abandoned for decades. The roofs of the houses were intact. None had collapsed under the weight of the snow, as one would expect in such conditions. The pathways, though covered by a thin layer of snow, were unnervingly smooth, as if someone had cleared them recently. "Someone's definitely still here," Sam muttered. but there was no conviction in his voice. I stared at the village, a creeping unease settling over me. There was complete silence. No sounds, no movement. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. No signs of people, no animals, no signs of life. Just the dark windows of the houses, like empty eyes watching us. When we reached the center of the village, I noticed Sam had tensed. He stopped, his eyes fixed on a house set slightly apart from the others. Standing in front of the door was a man. Tall and hunched, he was wrapped in a fur coat that had seen better days, blending into the desolate surroundings as if he were part of the place itself. As we drew closer, he lifted his head. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines, and hidden beneath a thick gray beard that left only his eyes exposed. Those eyes. They held the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. I realized he wasn't going to let us in without answers. "We're hunters," I said. "We heard there's a dangerous creature here. We're looking for it." He studied me for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Sam as though weighing us. After a pause, he finally gestured for us to come inside. The house was modest but warm. A large stove radiated heat, and there were just a few stools and an old, cracked table. Everything looked frozen in time, as if untouched for decades. Bundles of dried herbs and strange, twisted pieces of wood hung in one corner, suggesting he had some craft I couldn't identify. "My name's Stephen," he said, settling onto a stool. "Stephen Black, the last fool who stayed in this cursed place." He extended a hand, scarred and calloused, and I shook it. His fingers felt like wood, hard and unyielding. He began to talk, his voice steady but chilling. The village, he explained, had been abandoned long ago. People disappeared in the forest, and those who stayed were too afraid to leave their homes after dark. It all started when the White Devil appeared, a massive humanoid creature covered in white fur. No one could decide whether it was an animal, a man, or something else entirely. "People left," he said, staring somewhere past us. "Those who could, anyway. The rest, well, they were never seen again." Sam tried to ask questions, but Stephen's answers were evasive. He looked at us as if he knew we wouldn't believe the full truth. Eventually, he simply said, "Listen, don't go out at night. Don't wander too far into the forest, and for God's sake, stay away from the lair." "The lair?" I asked. He smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was bitter, resigned. "That's where it lives. No one goes there and comes back. If you go, you won't be telling any stories about it." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of certainty that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just a legend to him. He had seen something that kept him here despite the danger. I noticed he was holding back. His pauses, his careful words, his refusal to meet certain questions head-on. It all made his story feel even more ominous. I wanted to ask why he stayed, but Sam beat me to it. "Why are you here? Why take the risk?" Stephen looked at him for a long moment before answering in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear. "Someone has to stay." I didn't press further. Maybe he was just a lonely old man with nowhere else to go. Or maybe he knew something we didn't, something we weren't ready to hear. When we were getting ready to leave, Stephen stood up from his stool and, after a brief hesitation, offered, "There are a few houses here that'll work for the night. You can take one of them. I'll show you." His voice was steady, but I could sense an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if he was questioning whether we should stay at all. We thanked him, and he slowly stepped outside, carrying an old lantern that cast a dim, yellowish light. He gestured toward a house a little further down the road. It looked much like the others. Single-story, sloped roof, and a small porch half buried in snow. "This one will do. The stove's still working and you'll find wood inside," he said before turning and heading back to his own house without another word. Sam and I climbed the snow-covered porch, kicking the drifts away from the door, and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, but surprisingly clean for a place that looked abandoned. In the center of the room stood a large cast-iron stove with a neat pile of firewood stacked beside it. A worn wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed with a sagging but intact mattress completed the sparse furnishings. The walls were lined with hooks and shelves, holding a collection of forgotten tools and cracked ceramic pieces. Sam immediately set to work on the stove. Lighting the fire with such focus, it felt almost like a ritual for him. Meanwhile, I checked the windows and door, ensuring they were secure. Once the fire took hold, the room grew warmer, though the chill of the frosty air still lingered. We set our packs against the wall and I pulled out a can of food to eat. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Stephen didn't return, which, honestly, was a relief. His presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, leaving it heavy with an unspoken tension. Left alone, Sam and I sat in silence, the unease from the day still clinging to us. This village, Stephen's warnings, the strange quiet. It all felt like the setup to some dark tale, yet it was palpably real. When we lay down to rest, the silence was so deep it felt like a physical presence, pressing in on us from all sides. But then, it was broken. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But the sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow. My chest tightened and my hand instinctively reached for the rifle. Across the room, Sam was awake too. I could see him sit up carefully, trying not to make a sound. We didn't speak, we just listened. The footsteps circled the house, slow and heavy, as though whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know they were there. Then came a low, guttural sound like a deep growl that resonated in my chest. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't a bear. It was something else. I turned my eyes to the window. Frost coated the glass in intricate patterns, glinting faintly in the moonlight. But then the light dimmed. Something massive moved past the window, blocking out the glow. I couldn't make out details, but the silhouette was enormous, far larger than any human. A pale, hulking figure shifted in the shadows, its outline briefly illuminated before vanishing again into the darkness. Sam exhaled softly, and I realized he had seen it too. We sat frozen in place, gripping our weapons, as the footsteps outside gradually faded. Whatever it was had gone, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier and more oppressive than before. I stayed up for hours, rifle in hand, staring at the window. The frost glittered faintly once more, undisturbed. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and my body gave in to a restless, uneasy sleep. But even then, the memory of that figure lingered, haunting the edges of my dreams. Morning came bitterly cold, even for a place like this. Sam looked as exhausted as I felt, our sleepless night weighing heavy on both of us. The events of the night had left us with more questions than answers, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt compelled to uncover the truth. As soon as I heard him stir in the opposite corner of the room, I sat up and wasted no time. "We need to find that lair," I said. Sam looked at me, his expression full of doubt. "Are you serious? After what we saw? If that was what Stephen was talking about, we'd be crazy to go looking for it." I understood his hesitation. Honestly, Every instinct in me screamed to leave it alone. But something, maybe stubbornness, maybe sheer curiosity, drove me forward. "We didn't come all this way to hide," I shot back, checking my rifle. Sam hesitated, but after a moment he gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. Let's talk to Stephen. See what he has to say." As we stepped outside, we saw something that made my stomach turn. Tracks in the snow. Large, heavy, and unmistakable. Whatever had been outside last night was no figment of our imagination. It was real, and that fact alone made the air around us feel heavier. We made our way to Stephen's house. The door was ajar, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Inside, Stephen sat at his table, examining something in his hands. It was an intricate knot of twigs and roots, resembling some kind of talisman. When he noticed us, he set it aside and fixed us with a wary look. "You've made a decision," he rasped. I didn't mince words. "We're going to the lair." His face changed instantly. The man who seemed so unshaken by the harsh wilderness now looked stricken with fear. He pushed himself up from the table, leaning on it for support, and stared at us like we were lunatics. "You'll find nothing there but death," he said, his voice a mix of warning and plea. "That place isn't for men. Even the animals avoid it. I've seen what happens to those who go there. You won't understand until it's too late." But we stood firm. Sam didn't say much, but his silent presence beside me was enough to show Stephen we weren't backing down. I insisted we needed to know where the lair was. For a long moment, Stephen simply stared at us, then let out a heavy sigh and pointed toward the forest. "In the woods. When you reach the hill, you'll see a hollow. There's a massive oak there. That's it. But mark my words, you'd be better off turning back." We thanked him, though gratitude felt hollow in such a moment. Stephen shook his head, watching us leave as if he already knew what we were walking into. The forest greeted us with an eerie silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but a suffocating, oppressive stillness that made the air feel heavier with each step. The trees grew older and more twisted the deeper we went. Their moss-covered trunks seemed to lean toward us, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. The roots snaked across the ground, making every step a trial. Occasionally, we had to navigate around piles of fallen trees, stacked almost deliberately like barricades. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, but it wasn't just the chill. The air was thick, and not a single sound broke the silence. No birds, no rustling of animals, not even the whisper of wind. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. We moved wordlessly, each of us lost in our thoughts, though I could tell Sam felt the same unease I did. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, certain we were being watched. But there was nothing behind us, just the shadows and those ancient trees which seemed almost alive in their stillness. Sam must have noticed my unease because he muttered, "It's not too late to turn back." I wanted to say I'd been thinking the same, but all I could manage was a curt, "We're almost there." When we finally reached the hollow, a strange sense of relief washed over me. Not because the journey was over, but because the waiting was. The hollow was larger than I'd imagined, encircled by towering trees that stood like sentinels, their gnarled forms guarding the space from the outside world. At its center stood the oak. It was ancient and grotesque, its massive trunk twisted and its roots clawing out of the ground like serpents. Frost clung to its branches, which stretched skyward like skeletal hands. I paused to catch my breath, but Sam pressed forward, his movements tense as if he sensed something I didn't. "There," he said quietly, pointing. I followed his gaze but saw nothing at first. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A flash of white, darting between the trees. It was gone in an instant, but it had been there, no question. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, gripping my rifle tighter. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. We stood in tense silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The forest seemed to hold its breath with us. Sam stepped forward carefully, his movements deliberate to avoid snapping any branches. I wanted to call him back, but before I could, it happened. Something burst from the shadows, a blur of white, impossibly fast. There was a sharp whistling sound, and Sam cried out, collapsing to the ground. I rushed to him, my heart hammering as I saw the cause. A strange projectile, resembling a bone-crafted arrow, jutted from his shoulder. "Sam!" I shouted, raising my rifle. The white figure moved again, too fast to follow. I fired, but the shot hit nothing, the echo of the gunfire swallowed by the oppressive silence. Sam's breathing was labored, his face pale, and his hand trembled as he tried to touch the arrow. "Poison!" he gasped, his voice weak. I tore off my pack, pulling out what little supplies we had, and worked quickly to remove the arrow. A smooth shaft made of what looked like bone. I tied a bandage around the wound to slow the bleeding, but I knew that was the least of our worries. His skin was growing colder and his eyes began to lose focus. "Stay with me, Sam," I urged, masking my fear as best I could. Then I heard it. The faint sound of a branch snapping in the distance, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a mix of a growl and laughter, unearthly and mocking. I grabbed my rifle, positioning myself in front of Sam. The forest seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting as though something moved within them. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the trees, knowing that whatever was out there, it was watching us, waiting. We couldn't stay. I slung Sam's arm over my shoulder and hauled him up, his weight heavy against me. The forest felt endless, and every step was a battle against my growing fear. I didn't know how far we could get, but I knew one thing. We had to get out of there, or we'd never make it back. Dragging the injured Sam through the forest turned out to be a true ordeal. He grew heavier with each step, his weight pressing down on my shoulder, his legs folding beneath him like a puppet cut loose from its strings. I could feel him slipping further into unconsciousness. At first, he mumbled incoherently, fragments of words that were impossible to piece together, but soon even his voice faded. His skin turned ashen, almost translucent, and his breathing became shallow, each gasp a fragile thread tethering him to life. I could no longer afford to be afraid of what lurked within the woods. Each step was agony, but all I could think about was reaching the village, reaching Stephen. He was our only hope. When the rooftops of the houses finally appeared, relief nearly brought me to my knees. Stephen was already standing on his porch, as if he had been waiting for us. The moment he saw me dragging Sam, he rushed over, his face serious but calm. Together, we carried Sam into his home and laid him on the bed. "What happened?" he asked, though there was no surprise in his voice. It was as if he already knew the answer. I quickly recounted the attack. Stephen inspected the wound with a grave expression. "This is bad," he muttered. "That poison works fast. He needs an antidote." A cold dread settled over me. "Antidote? What do we do?" Stephen sighed deeply, sitting down on a stool by the bed. His gaze drifted past me as though he was recalling something from a distant, darker time. "The White Devil. It's not just a beast. It was once a man. Long ago he lived in these parts, but the forest claimed him. No one knows exactly how, but they say he became the guardian of this land. The forest protects itself through him, and he, in turn, through the forest. Stephen's weary eyes met mine. This forest, it's not like others. It's alive, and it's malevolent. What are we supposed to do? My voice came out harsher than I intended. Exhaustion and frustration clawed at me. I had no patience for riddles. Stephen hesitated before answering. If you want to save your friend, you'll have to go back. The antidote, he might have it, but understand this, he won't give it up easily. I looked down at Sam. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing growing more labored by the second. Time was running out. Gripping my rifle until my knuckles turned white, I made my decision. I didn't have a choice. Sam wouldn't survive without me. I glanced at Stephen, then back at Sam, and gave a curt nod. I'll go back. I stepped into the night, once again swallowed by the silence of the forest. Everything now depended on me. When I returned to the hollow where the massive oak stood, it looked even more menacing than before. Its thick, gnarled trunk seemed to twist and reach toward me, cracks running deep into the bark like ancient scars. Frost clung to its branches, unmoving, impervious to the biting wind. This wasn't just a tree. It was something ancient, alive, and utterly alien. Circling the oak, I studied it like a soldier surveying unfamiliar terrain. With each step, I felt a strange vibration underfoot, as if the earth itself pulsed with life. Near one of the enormous roots, I spotted something peculiar. A dark fissure in the ground, partially obscured by tangled roots. It wasn't just a crevice, it was an entrance. Leaning closer, I realized it was a tunnel. A shiver ran through me, but I couldn't stop now. Sam needed the antidote, and time was slipping away. Clutching my lantern and checking my rifle one last time, I descended into the darkness. The tunnel was far larger than I had anticipated. Its walls were lined with roots that stretched downward, intertwining like a massive living web. The air was thick with a damp, earthy smell, tinged with decay. Step by cautious step, I illuminated the path ahead. The flickering light revealed unsettling details, scattered animal bones, old hides nailed to the walls. Every step felt like a struggle. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on me, and the silence was suffocating. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, too intrusive. The tunnel twisted and split, as though it had been dug without purpose or design. At times, the passage narrowed so much I had to crouch to continue. The deeper I went, the stronger the sensation that I was being watched. I would stop, glance over my shoulder, but all I ever saw were shifting shadows cast by my lantern. It was as if the tunnel itself was alive, an organism that had swallowed me whole. Finally, I reached a wide chamber that seemed to be the heart of this place. The walls were adorned with skulls. Moose, bears, and humans. They were piled in a grim pyramid in one corner, a macabre monument that made my grip on the rifle tighten. My pulse quickened. This place was wrong, unnatural. But I had to keep going. I had to find him, the White Devil. And I knew he was already here, watching, waiting. And then I felt it, his presence. At first, it was a subtle sensation, a chill running down my spine as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. Then came the sound, a faint rustle that made every muscle in my body tense. I turned, and there, in the shadows, it emerged. At first, I saw only the outline, a massive figure hunched to fit under the low ceiling of the tunnel. Then the beam of my lantern caught it. It was a creature beyond anything I could have conjured in my darkest nightmares. Towering, nearly 7 feet tall, its body was cloaked in thick white fur that shimmered under the lantern's light, like snow under the moon. Its form was humanoid, but the elongated limbs, clawed hands, and broad, powerful shoulders betrayed its beastly nature. The face? The face was a haunting blend of wolf and man. An elongated snout, razor-sharp teeth that gleamed unnaturally, and eyes. Those eyes were the worst. They were filled with a sorrow so deep, it seemed to reach through me as if they could see not just me, but everything I feared, everything I regretted. I raised my rifle, my hands trembling violently. The creature stared back at me but made no move to attack. Instead, a low, guttural sound emerged from its throat, somewhere between a growl and an attempt at speech. And then I heard the voice. It was rough, rasping as though unused to forming words. "You should not have come," it said, the words echoing down the tunnel, making the walls feel as if they were closing in. Who are you?" I stammered, struggling to keep the rifle steady. The creature tilted its head, its eyes scanning me as though deciding if I was worth answering. Slowly it straightened, the soft rustling of its fur like the sound of boots crunching snow. I was human. Once. But the forest, it took me. I didn't know how to respond. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, but the creature continued. "The forest. It's alive. It protects itself. And I became its guardian. This is where all trespassing paths end." I struggled to comprehend what I was hearing. Why? Why do you kill people? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. It shook its head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I do not kill. The forest does. It punishes those who come with weapons, those who seek to destroy. It feeds on their fear, their lives. I am only its instrument." "I need the antidote," I said, forcing the words out. But the creature only shook its head again. It didn't seem hostile, but every instinct I had screamed not to trust it. Sam was dying, and this creature held the key to saving him. Whatever it was saying about the forest, its purpose, or its role, I didn't have time to untangle the truth. Sam was all that mattered. If there was no antidote, then I had to take a different path. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely audible as I raised the rifle again. The creature didn't flinch. Its mournful eyes locked onto mine, as if it already knew what was coming, as if it had seen this moment 1,000 times before. I fired. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed in the confined space, leaving my ears ringing. The bullet struck its chest, throwing it back against the wall. It convulsed in pain but didn't fall. Its hands gripped the roots around it, struggling to rise, and in that moment, I dropped the rifle, drew my knife, and lunged. Up close, its size was overwhelming. The fur was warm, dense, almost alive, resisting my every move as if the forest itself was pushing back. But I couldn't stop now. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as instinct took over. The blade found its mark, sinking into the base of its neck. The creature shuddered violently, releasing a sound that was more a sigh than a scream. Then it went limp. I stood there, gasping for air, the knife still clutched in my trembling hand. Everything around me seemed to pause. Even the oppressive silence of the forest deepened, as though it too was holding its breath, watching what I had done. Slowly, I knelt beside the creature's lifeless form, my hands slick with blood. I gripped its head, severing it with a final, decisive motion. It was heavier than I expected, the blood warm as it dripped down my arms. I couldn't stop. This was why I had come. This was what I needed. For Sam. For proof. For survival. When I returned to Stephen's house, clutching the creature's severed head, I rushed straight to Sam's bedside. His face was deathly pale, and his breaths were so faint they were almost imperceptible. I held out the head to Stephen. "Here, I did it. We have a chance to save him," I rasped, my voice barely audible as exhaustion clawed at me. Stephen silently looked at the head, then at me. His expression remained calm, but there was a weight in his eyes, a kind of resignation that made my stomach drop. He nodded and knelt beside Sam, beginning to work. He applied herbs, rubbed a pungent liquid onto Sam's skin, and murmured words that sounded like a prayer or an incantation. I stood by, gripping the edge of the bed, clinging to the last threads of hope. But as the minutes dragged on, Sam's grip on life weakened. His breaths grew slower, his body colder. Finally, Stephen stopped. He straightened and turned to me, his face etched with a quiet sorrow. "He's gone," he said softly. Those two words hit harder than anything I'd endured in the past days. I sank down beside Sam, taking his lifeless hand in mine. Every part of me screamed in anguish and fury. I had done everything, and it wasn't enough. The mission, the fight, the sacrifices, all of it had cost him his life. Stephen placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did all you could," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the forest's curse, it's not something that can simply be destroyed. This forest always finds a new guardian. It's a cycle, one that's gone on for generations. You killed one, but another is already waiting to take its place." I turned to him, disbelief and frustration flooding through me. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Stephen looked away, exhaling deeply. "The forest always takes what it needs. You'll see for yourself." When I left the house, the day was nearly over. The sky was painted in deep shades of crimson, and long shadows stretched across the ground. I wandered toward the edge of the village, my mind a storm of grief and confusion. Sam's death weighed on me like a stone, but Stephen's words gnawed at me even more. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. On the hill just beyond the graveyard, a figure stood. At first I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was real. A massive creature cloaked in white fur loomed among the trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, it simply stood there watching me. My heart clenched. It was a new, white devil. The forest had already chosen its replacement. A chill ran through me, and the weight of futility crushed me. All my efforts, all the sacrifices, and nothing had changed. The cycle continued, and I was now a part of its story. I turned away, unable to look any longer, and walked slowly back toward my tent. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let me leave. But one thing was certain: I would never be the same. This forest, this horror, this death, they were burned into me, and I would carry them forever.